Hey guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make this Vellum simulation in Blender. It's not an actual simulation because Geometry Nodes just kind of doesn't have that capability right now. But you can see here we have this plane and it's got controllable moving with an empty. And when you animate it, you can see it's got some nice displacement and these little things, they bounce. And it looks pretty good. This was the inspiration for this on Twitter. It's a really cool animation. This is Houdini, so it looks way better than what I made. Houdini is just really cool for simulations, but for just native Blender, I think this is a pretty cool result, and I hope I can show you how to do it today, and I hope you learn something. I know it's kind of a long tutorial. This is a bit of a beefy node setup, and I do go pretty in-depth on the explanations on everything, so I do apologize that it is pretty long, but I hope you enjoy, and yeah, see you in Blender. So the first thing we're going to want to do is set up our scene. Now I already have my scene set up, and if you want to, you can download my starter file in the description. I have a modeling tab, a noding tab, animation, UV editing, and compositing, because those are the only things I ever use. So if you want, you can download that, but if not, then you can just, here I'll show you. You can just go like this, drag a new tab out by clicking and dragging from the corner, and then go to Geometry Nodes Editor. But like I said, I don't need to do that because I already have mine set up. So now that we've done that, I'm going to make a new object. It doesn't matter what object it is. It doesn't even have to be a mesh, actually. It could be like a curve because we're not going to use any of it. I'm going to go into my Geometry Nodes tab and hit New. And then, like I said, we can just delete the group input. We do not need it at all. And then let's make a grid. I spelled that wrong, but it's still there. And if we can Control Shift and click on this with Node Wrangler, and that'll bring up our viewer, or we can just connect it to our group output. Doesn't really matter right now. And you can see we have a cube, or not a cube, sorry, a grid. And if I go into wireframe by hitting Shift Z, you can see it's not very high resolution, and for an effect like this we need some geometry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set these vertices to like 50. That seems like a good amount. And I'm going to leave the size the same. It doesn't really matter what size it is. So at this point, our plane is down here, but we want it to be rotated. So in Geometry Nodes, we can just make a transform node and just transform that on the y-axis by 90 degrees. So it's just sitting upright. There we go. We have our plane. And now what we need to do is, actually first let's define what we're trying to do. We have two planes, right? And we want them to kind of go like this, and we want them to go away from each other, and we want them to have some holes like I showed you in here. This has holes in it, so we want to have some holes in it. But what we can see here is these two sides are identical, so all we need to do is just make one side, and then we can just duplicate it and move it, and then that will work. However, we can't rotate it because when we have the strings kind of coming out of our object, if we have these strings here and then we rotate it, they're going to be in the wrong place. Like if we have a string here, if we rotate it 180 degrees, then this string on the new plane will be over here, if that makes any sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a join geometry, and then I'm going to make a store named attribute node. Now the reason for this is because I want to make sure I can later down the line differentiate between the two planes. So I can just call this like -x plane. Let's say this one is going in the negative direction in x, so that would be going this way. And we don't need a second store named attribute because we can just use the inverse of this one. Oops, we can just use the inverse of this one. Basically what we're going to do for this is we have our store named attribute with our -x plane, and I'm going to set that to boolean, and just set the value to true. So whatever geometry is in this is going to be true. And then I'm just going to plug this original transform also into the join geometry. So you can see when I do that, over here in the top left, the triangles and all of those double. So you can see we're making two planes. In my original animation, I had some holes in my Vellum. You can do this pretty simply by just using a delete geometry before the transform node, because we want these to be the same on both sides of our Vellum, right? We want the holes to be on the same side for both of them. So we can just take a delete geometry, and then everything's going to disappear. So I'm just going to make a noise texture and plug this factor into the selection in our delete geometry. And then you can see nothing happens right now. And I can show you why. If we control shift click on our grid, it's going to show us the original geometry. This only works in 3.4, by the way, this viewer node. If not, you have to do some other stuff for that. But I would recommend downloading 3.4. It's a great addition for geometry nodes. And then we can control shift click on our noise texture as well. And you can see our noise texture here. All of it is more than 0. So the way Booleans work with values is anything that's greater than 0 is going to be true. But anything that equals 0 is going to be false. But you can see here our noise texture, everything is more than 0 because nothing is black. Black equals 0 in the value scale. So what we're going to do is we can take a color ramp. We can take a color ramp and put that in between the noise texture. And then we can just drag this black shader up, or this black slider up, until we get some black. So there you go. And now if we plug this color into the selection on our delete geometry and we just delete our viewer node, that'll bring us back to this original group output. You can see we have our faces, or our mesh, being deleted. But we have these weird little lines, and that's because we're deleting points. We need to switch this to the face domain. And there we go. Now you can see we are only deleting points, or I mean faces, my bad. And I want this to be pretty subtle with just some big holes. So I'm going to turn this down, or the scale. Oh, no, wrong way. I'm going to turn the scale up, like 15 maybe. Yeah, around there's good. And then I'm just going to do this. Just get your color ramp looking nice to where you want it. That looks good. And these are going to be square right now. And we're going to fix that later down the line, so you can just ignore it. They'll get rounded off eventually. But one thing, you might want to change the seed on your noise texture. And one way to do that is you could set it to 4D and change the W. You can see that that's changing the seed. But what I prefer to do is I prefer to take a position node. And you can see in our vector, this vector is originally vector field based on position attribute from geometry. So if we plug this position node in here, nothing's going to change because position is the default for this vector. But we can take a vector math and plug that in here, and now we can just change this add value, and that's basically changing the seed, and it's much faster to computate. Here, if I can turn on timings, and then just, you can look at this delete geometry. It's 0.51 seconds with this method, but if I switch it to 4D, it's 0.65. And stuff like that adds up. So any place you can optimize, it's always good to. So there we go. We can now change the seed on our noise texture. And we can just plug a value node into here so that we can control all 3 vectors at once. And now this is basically our seed. So I'm just going to hit F2 and rename this seed. And then I'm going to select all of this up to the delete geometry and hit Control J and then F2 to make a new frame, and then name it, I'll name it deleting geo. There we go. So now after this join geometry, I'm going to use a subdivision surface node, and you can see that kind, oh my god, that went way too far in. That kind of rounds them out. They're still pretty blocky, you can see, but that's fine. That'll get smoothed out later. We're going to use a smooth modifier at the end of this just to make sure everything looks real nice, but we don't have to worry about it right now. I want to be able to control when this mesh splits off, like I've been showing you, with an empty object. So first of all, I'm just going to pin this so it doesn't go away when I select other objects by hitting this little pin up here. And by the way, actually we should name this, so let's name this Vellum. And now I'm going to pin it. And then I can hit Shift A and go to an empty, and I'm just going to do plain axes. And then that's all we really need to do with it right now. I'm just going to move it up a little bit. And we can go back into our geo nodes. And first of all, actually I forgot to name stuff, so that's always important. I'm going to call this lock location control. And then I'm just going to call our original object geo, or no, I'll call it Vellum. So now we have our subdivision. We want to offset this position. So what we can do is we can take a set position node, and you can see we can use this offset with the X, but that's offsetting the whole mesh. And what we want to do is we want anything above this to be offset, but anything below it to not be. So the way we can do that is we can just drag this location controller from our outliner into the geometry nodes, and it drops in an object info right away. What we're going to do is we are going to get what's above this and what's beneath it. And for a lot of times you can use separate XYZ, and then you compare what's less than, but I want kind of a gradient so that it smoothly transitions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a vector math node from this location, and I'm going to set this to multiply. And I'm just going to multiply every axis by 0 except for the z-axis, because that's all we care about. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going to grab a position node and just duplicate this multiply and plug this position into it. And you may be wondering why I'm still doing this with vectors if I'm only using the z-axis. And that's because I want to take this multiply and plug it into another vector math set to distance. And then I can take these two vectors and plug this into distance. And now if I control shift and click on this subdivision surface node and this, you can see we have a gradient from where our location controller is up and down. But we only want this to be up, right? What we can do is we can take a compare node set to vector and then plug these two in, the same as we did with the distance. So now I can control shift and click on this and look at the viewer node, and you can see that our entire mesh is black, which means that this entire vector is 0. And the reason for that is because this is set to element wise, which basically multiplies every vector individually, but we want to set this to average. And there you go. So that takes the average of the vectors and compares those. And now we have a gradient of what is beneath and what is above. And I'm actually just going to switch these so that gradient is inverted, because I want white to be on top and black to be on bottom. And then I'm going to take a map range node and plug this distance into here. We're not going to do anything to this map range for now. This is just going to come in handy later so that we can change how much our object is going, basically. Now what we can do is we can take this result and plug it into a math node set to multiply, and then we can multiply it by this greater than, and then I'm going to take a vector math node set to scale, and this vector is just going to be 1, and then we can scale it by this value, and then we plug this into the offset. Oh wait, sorry, it's going to be 1 only on the x axis, so that should be 1 0 0. You can see if we bring this up, and you can see our mesh moves. This honestly looks pretty bad right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this map range, like I said, and set this to smoother step. And now you can see we have a nice smooth movement. But I don't really want this. This is going a little too far for me. So what I can do is I can change this to max value. This to max is basically how far it'll go. I'm going to set this to like 0.2 maybe. And I want this to start going faster, because you can see our empty is almost at the bottom and the top isn't even at its max yet. I can change this from max, and you can see that makes the gradient harsher or softer. So I'm going to change this from max to like 0.5. Now if we move our empty, it's moving over, and I'd say that's a good speed. These are all the values I used for my original project, by the way. But we only have what looks like one plane. It's only going in one direction, and like I did back here, we had 2 planes. The reason for this is because we're scaling both of them by the same vector. So what we can do is we can take a switch node set to vector, and I'm just going to put this to 1 0 0 being false and negative 1 0 0 being true. This is where this store named attribute that we got comes in handy, because we can just take a named attribute and set it to whatever we called this. I called mine negative x plane, so I'll just type in here negative x plane, and there you can see it comes up. And we can plug this attribute into the switch node, and then this output into the vector. And you can see now we have 2 planes that are displacing. And this already looks pretty cool. I really like the way it moves. That looks pretty great. What I want to do now is I want to actually animate our empty, because it's kind of annoying to have to move it every time, you know? So I'm just going to start it at the top, hit I, location, and then I'll go to like frame 250 and move it to the bottom. And go I, location. So now we have our empty moving down and kind of pulling these 2 apart. Kind of looks like it's slicing them down the middle. I'm just going to set it in the middle here so we can see what's going on. In the middle of my timeline, that is. And now I'm just gonna do some organization. Always organize your nodes. It makes them so much easier to read. So what I want to do is I want to store another attribute. And this one is going to be called, I'm going to call it zdist for z distance. You can call it whatever you want. And I'm just going to plug this value into here. And we're going to use this later for the stringy bits that kind of stick in the middle. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make some space. And I want my nodes to be a little bigger. And I'm going to make another set position node. And I'm going to make a position. And this one's going to start kind of the same way as the last one did, with a vector math set to multiply. We're going to multiply the z and y by 1, but the x by 0. And then what we're going to do is we need another vector math set to distance, and we're going to take the distance between this vector and the distance between this position. And basically what that's doing is it's taking a vector, the original position, which is this, right? And then it's comparing it to a line down the middle, basically, because we're taking everything except for the x value. So it's going to be the same positions, but just in the middle. And then it's going to compare these. We can look at this with the viewer node. If we just Control-Shift-Click and then on this set position, we can see this distance. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a map range node set to smoother step and plug this distance in. And then I'm not really going to touch this. I'm just doing it to make the gradient smoother. Plug this into a mix node, but I want this to be the factor. And we're going to mix a vector. We're going to mix this original position. Actually, I'm going to make a new position node just over here for the sake of organization. We're going to mix this original position with this new position that has the z, or the x value set to 0. And then we can plug this into the position, and you can kind of see it just kind of makes the effect a lot less prevalent, the effect we already had. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just move all of these over, and then I'm going to make a float curve in between this map range and the mix. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a new point in the middle and drag it down to like basically the very bottom left. So basically I'm going to do that and plug that into the factor for this float curve, and that's just going to make the effect we're making right now snappier. And I'm also going to turn this clamp factor off. We want that for later. So now what I want to do is, this is affecting the entire mesh, which I don't want to happen. And we could use a random value here set to Boolean. Just turn the probability down and plug that into selection. Whoa. Yeah, I want to turn that probability way down. But you can see here, they're different on both sides for this. And that's why we can't do that. But what we can do is we could go all the way back here, back to the very start. And before, in between our delete geometry and our transform node, we can do another store named attribute. And then use a random value here, set to Boolean. And we also have to set this to Boolean, plug this into here, and I'm just going to call this like stringy bits. And I'm going to turn this probability down to like 0.02. Now we have this attribute. We can go back here and take a named attribute called stringy bits and plug this into the selection. Boom. But you can see now they never go away. They just kind of stick there, but they are stretching, which looks pretty nice. So what I'm going to do is, now this will be a while before we get to like see the result, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a scene time node, plug the seconds into a math node set to sine, and basically what sine does is it takes whatever value you have and on a graph goes like this basically, and it kind of just oscillates between two values, and that's what we want for when our stretchy bits go like they bounce. We want them to kind of go between two values. So in between the sine and the seconds, we want to put a divide node, but I'm just going to set this to 1 right now because we can't see it, so we can't tell how slow we want it to be. But basically, the more we turn this up, the slower the effect will be. But like I said, I'm just going to leave it at 1 right now. And then I'm going to do an add node, and I'm going to add 1. Because you'll see up here, if I unplug this value from the mix node, 1 is at our original position, and 0 is at 0. But if I turn this to 2, it's going to go back the other way. So what we can do is we can have our sine node go from some value above 1, and we can have it go from there to 0, and this can be whatever number. It can be 2, 3, but it's basically just going to bounce between these two, but it's going to eventually settle at 1, right? And now the way we can do that, we can actually look at this right now. If we Control-Shift-Click on both of these, we can see it's kind of oscillating between white, which is 1, and black, which is 0. And it's actually staying at white more because it's going it's going to 0, then to 1, which is white, but then it's going to some value ahead of 1. So it's going to look like it's staying at 1 for more, but the white is just 1 or more. Actually, I want to use the frame value here. I don't want to use the divide value. My bad. My mistake. We're going to use the frame value, and then we're going to divide that by 5. There we go. That looks good. So now it's oscillating between black and white. And I'll just keep this viewer node here. Why not? We can see what we're doing. Now we need to go and take this zdist attribute that we captured earlier and take a named attribute. And then we need to multiply this, and I'm going to multiply it by a random value. I'm going to multiply it by a random value from like 0.4 to just 1. And if we Control-Shift-Click on this, it's going to look kind of crazy, and that's because the random value is decided per vertex. So every vertex gets a random value, so it looks really blocky. But that doesn't really matter because remember, we're stretching kind of individual vertices here. So each one of them will have a random value, even if this looks weird. And now we can take a map range, and I'm going to turn this from max to 0.075. So if we Control-Shift-Click on this, you can see that makes it a lot brighter at the top. But what I want to do is I want to set this to max to 0 and the 2 min to 1. So now we have really bright on the bottom and black on the top, because this is going to be what's affecting how much they bounce. So if I play this animation and look at it from the side, you can see the black is coming down. So if this white is 1 and this black is 0, and we multiply the factor by this, this is going to be more than 1 though. Remember, because we did our sine stuff. I digress. We can take this and multiply it by it, and then we have our black to white. It's basically going to be multiplying the stretchiness by this, and then once it turns to black, it's going to be multiplied by 0, and anything by 0 is 0, right? So it's not going to stretch anymore. And now I'm going to take another mix node, plug this in here with this as the factor, and then this add node into B, sorry, and A is going to be 0, or 1. So now you can see the bottom of this is going to be blinking, and the top is going to be staying white. And I can multiply this float curve. I'll just take a math node and set this to multiply, and multiply it by this mix node. And then if you plug it in, you'll see nothing happens, and that's because I made a mistake apparently. Back here on this map range, this has to be set to 0.1, not 1. So my bad. But now if we play it, you can see they're stretching and they're kind of bouncing. There we go. And I want to make this float curve a little stronger so that they kind of stay and then they move back faster. There we go. You can see if you look out the back, they come back and they kind of swing and bounce. So now we have our bouncing pretty much done. We're going to change a few things. First of all, I'm going to add a merge by distance after this set position so that in the middle, when our strings are connected, they get merged together. I think now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give these some thickness and smooth them because I'm bored of looking at these paper thin sheets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a modifier, and I'm going to add a solidify, and I'm going to set this offset to 1, and this thickness I'm going to make it really low, like 0.005. And then I'm going to add a modifier smooth, and you can make the smooth modifier in geometry nodes, by the way, but it requires a lot of iteration, and it's really tedious. It's not worth it in my opinion. And I'm just going to turn this repeat up to like 30. I'm going to crank it. So now you can see without this smooth, it's really jagged, and then with it, it's nice and smooth. And if I play this back, it's already going to be looking pretty good. Boom, stretching. So this isn't really bouncing as much as I want it to. You can see it kind of bounces, but not really. It is more prevalent without the smooth modifier. But if we want the smooth modifier, we want to make this more prevalent. So I want to go back to our location math, and I'm going to just move all of these nodes down. So now that I've made some space, I'm going to just make a redirect here by holding shift and right clicking and just move that up. And then I want to select my map range and my multiply and control shift and D. And what that'll do is that will duplicate them and keep what they have selected, or what they have connected, still connected. And then what I want to do with this map range is I want to reset it, turn clamp off, and then go from max 1.2 and then 0 to 1. And this is going to be smoother step. And then we can plug this multiply into this Z distance. And now you can already see if I undo and redo that, you can see kind of some bouncing, even though it's static. If I play this now, you can see we got some bouncing. And basically, the more I increase this from max, if I just pause it here, the more I increase this from max, the higher up they'll bounce. So if I turn it way up, they'll just keep bouncing forever. But I'm going to set this to like, I think I'll set it to like 1.5. Yeah, that looks nice. I like that. Hey, editing Dan here. When you finish this project, you might notice that sometimes when you're opening it up at the very start, the stretches aren't there, and then they kind of pop into existence. The thing that you have to do is this map range that we're working on right now. You have to set this to min to just like a really small value, like 0.03 is what I set mine at, and then it works, and the stretches are always there. Forgot to mention that in the tutorial, but make sure you do that because it makes it more believable when they don't just pop into existence. So anyways, back to the tutorial. Let's do some more organization. Like I said, always good. And then I'm actually just going to shade this smooth, so I'm going to use a set shade smooth node. And this is looking good, but like it's boring. It's not natural at all. We want some noise in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take another supposition, as always. We can take a noise texture, plug the color into the offset, and that's crazy. So you can see it moved up here, and the reason for that is because the average of a noise texture is 0.5, so we can just take a vector math and subtract 0.5 from it, and it'll be centered again. And now what I want to do is I don't want this to move on the x-axis, because this noise is going to be only for the stringy bits. So I want to multiply this by 1 on everything except for the x-axis. So now it's just moving up and down and on the y-axis, but not on the x-axis, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to turn the scale down to like 1. There we go. And we can leave all the other settings the same, but I'm going to use the same selection from this set position for this one. So that way it only happens on these stringy parts. But you can see it's happening even if they're not currently sticking. And what we can do is we can go back here and we can multiply this boolean, the stringy bits boolean, take a math node and multiply, and we can multiply this by the z distance named attribute, and then you can see those disappear. So now it's only happening on ones that are above it. However, it is also happening when it gets too high up. You can use this distance value from all the way back here. I'm going to plug this into a reroute to a map range. Before we do anything, we can take a scale node after this multiply and plug this map range in here. And then I'm going to set this map range from min, going to keep that the same. From max, I'm going to set that to 0.075. And then I'm going to invert this to min to max. So to min will be 1, to max will be 0. It looks pretty similar still, but that's because our noise isn't animated. It's not moving at all. We can take the scene time, and for this one, I'm actually going to make this 4D. So I actually find it better to use the W than, where was it? Than this position trick I showed you. I find it better when you're doing noise textures that are like animated. Since that deletion one is staying still, I like it for that purpose. But for stuff like this, the W is normally better. And you can see now our stringy bits, if I plug the seconds in, you can see they're kind of wobbling about. We now have that part of our noise done. But trust me, there's going to be some other parts. We're going to use another set position node, and I'm just going to do some cleanup over here. So now we can take another noise texture, and for the scale on this noise texture, I'm going to set it to like 1.5, and then we're going to do the same thing for the last one. We're going to take the color, vector math, subtract 0.5, and then actually for this one, we're going to do back here, we did this multiply, but we're skipping that for this one. We're just going to do a scale, and that's just so that we can change the strength of this basically. And then we can plug this into the offset, and that's kind of crazy. So I'm going to turn the scale like 0.3. 0.2. Yeah, 0.2 is good. And then I'm going to bring this back over here. I want this to be closer so that I can use the same scene time node. And I'm going to plug this in. And it's moving a little too fast for me. I want this to go pretty slow. Oh wait, no, that's the scale. Wrong value. I need to set this noise texture to 40 and then plug this into the W. And that's definitely moving too fast for me. So I'm going to like take a math node and I'm going to divide this by like 20. Yeah, looks good. And then now I'm going to take this and Control-Shift-D it, just all of that, all the noise, all the vector maths. And I want this noise texture to be much smaller scale. It's still going to be 4D, but I'm going to turn the scale up to like 8, and I'm going to turn the detail up a little bit to also like around 8. And then this divide, I want it to be a little lower because I want this to be kind of like a wind-ish type of distortion. And then if I plug this into the offset instead of this scale, we can just look at this. We need to turn this down. This is way too much for me. 0.05? Yeah, 0.05 looks good. So you can either do this by adding 2 set position nodes, plugging both of them into the offsets, or you can just do it with a vector math set to add and just add both of these together. And then now we have some distortion on it. And this looks pretty good. This is kind of the finished effect, at least in a viewport mode, because we haven't done any shading. Let's start with our materials. I'm going to get a new workspace up here for my shader editor. So I'm going to make a new material, and I'll just call this Vellum. And then I'm going to make a set material, and that'll go after this set shade smooth. And I'm going to change this material to Vellum. So now if we go in rendered view, it looks normal, right? Because this is principled. But let's say we want a noise texture. We can control shift click on this. Actually, let's say a wave texture, because that's what we're going to be using for this texture. We're going to be using 2 wave textures. It's crazy and distorted. And if we try to use UV textures, which is what we're going to be doing, let's take a texture coordinate and plug the UV in here. It's just going to turn into nothing because we have no UV data for this. What we have to do is we have to UV unwrap this. It's not that hard to UV unwrap in geometry nodes, but for this one, you have to put it in a very specific place. And that place is going to be all the way back here. So basically now what we have to do is we have to UV unwrap this, like I said. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a UV unwrap node, which I think was added in 3.3, maybe? So we have this UV unwrap, and we can store the named attribute, and we'll just call this new underscore UV. And then take this to vector, plug this UV into there. We have this store named attribute, and for UVs, you want to set it to face corner for the domain. But you can see I have my timings on. This is taking forever to calculate. So what I want to do is I want to take a switch node. You see how slow everything is, and I can just take another is viewport node and plug this into the switch node, and then just take this original geometry and plug this into the true. And what that does is it basically just UV unwraps it only if it's a render. It'll only UV unwrap it now if it's in the render, which makes it much faster for viewport performance, but you can't see it. You can't see the textures. So what I can do is I can just mute this switch node whenever I want to be texturing. So if I go back up here, now to my textures and into render view, you see it's the same. And that's because we can't write directly to the UV properties in geometry nodes. So what we have to do is we have to take an attribute. And since we stored this named attribute, we can just call this attribute in our shader editor. The same thing, new UV, plug this vector into the vector for the wave texture, and now you can see everything is correct. However, they're kind of rotated, which would matter somewhere else, but it actually doesn't matter at all for us because we're going to duplicate this. We're going to duplicate this wave texture and set this X value to Y. Then we can plug this vector in, and now we can mix between these, and I'm just going to set this, we can keep it at 0.5, so it's going to be directly mixing between the wave textures equally. And now I want to change all of these values, the scale, distortion, detail, all that. I want to change it on both the wave textures. So I'm just going to make a value node and then duplicate this down a couple times. This one will be scale. So I'll call this one scale. This one will be distortion. And this one will be detail. Oh, caps lock, detail. So now we can plug the scale in. Oops. The scale into our scale, distortion into distortion, and detail into detail. But these are all 0 right now. So I'm going to change the scale. I'm going to make this like 500. I want the scale to be huge, just so we have this tiny little weaves going across. And then I'm going to turn the distortion up to maybe like 1. Actually, I'm going to turn that way up actually, like 7, just so that we have some irregularities. And the detail, I'm going to crank all the way to 15. And actually, before this mix, I want to make a color ramp. And I'm just going to turn this black up a little bit. And I'll just duplicate it and do it the same for the other wave texture. And this texture, by the way, is from a guy named Ryan King Art. I'll put a picture of his channel on the screen. He makes a lot of really good procedural texture videos, so go check him out if you want. This is his method. I take no responsibility for this method at all. This is his texture. So now I want to plug this mix into a color ramp, and basically all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to turn this black up a little bit to a kind of gray. And then I want to plug this into the base color, the principled. And we can use this color ramp for both the base color and the roughness. I'm actually going to turn this up a little bit because I don't want it to be very rough. Or I want it to be very rough, is what I meant. And then I'm going to change the alpha. So I'm going to take this mix and turn it into a map range. Whoa, that's a vector. We want this to be a float. Plug this mix into the value. And then I'm going to keep everything the same except for this 2min is going to be 0.3 because I don't want anything to be completely transparent, but I want it to be semi-transparent. So I'm going to plug this into the alpha. And now you can see these black spots are pretty transparent. So this is already looking pretty good, but what's going to really make it is bump. This project will use 3 bump nodes. So I'm going to take one from this mix, plug that into a bump, and I want this to be into the height, and I'm going to control shift click on this bump node, and I don't want it to be that strong. I want it to be like 0.2 maybe, up a little bit. Yeah, like 0.5. That's good. And then now I want to add some more noise to this. So I'm going to take a noise texture, and I'm going to just duplicate this attribute from up here that has our UV in it. I'm going to plug this vector into the vector on the noise texture. And then I'm going to turn the scale way up to like 50 and the detail all the way up to 15. And then make another bump node with the strength lowered to like around like 0.15 and plug this factor into the height. So you can see now we're getting some extra variation from that noise, which is good. So I'm going to duplicate this noise again, and we're going to make another bump node. I don't want either of those to be inverted. I didn't mean to do that. And then this noise texture is going to be really small, like 1,000. And then I'm going to keep everything else the same except for distortion. That's going to go up to 1. And I'm going to plug this vector into the vector again. And then plug factor into height. So now if I zoom in really far on this one, you can see if I mute and unmute this bump node, we're just getting kind of that finer detail in there, which is going to really polish this off. And I want to turn the strength up a little bit, a little too weak. Yeah, that's good. And then plug this normal into the normal there. And boom. We now have a Vellum stretching animation. I can't play this in real time because of this UV unwrap node. Makes it incredibly slow. But if I just unmute this switch node, we will be able to play it, but it's just going to look like semi-transparent nothingness. But I just want to get to a part where there's a stretch. So it looks like there's one right here. And I want to unmute this. And you can see here, the texture is stretching, the UV is stretching. So like over here, the UV is normal, but then as it gets over here, it gets more stretched. And normally that would be an issue for UVs. But in our case, it actually works pretty well because this material is stretching. Our vellum is stretching. So the texture stretching actually kind of helps. There is one thing I need to do though. You can see there's kind of this line on the object where it's being distorted, which isn't that noticeable, but it's an easy fix. So why not, right? And so this is easily fixable, like I said, by just going back here to the initial geometry section and changing this transform, this x to like negative 0.001 or something. Just make it a tiny value. And then we're going to duplicate this transform and plug this geometry from this store named attribute in here. And then we only want this transform node should only go in here once. So it's going through the store attribute, go into the geometry. And then we want this one to go in here. And this one's translation will be positive 0.001. So now you can see that line is gone, and basically we're just moving it a tiny bit away from each other, which you can kind of see here. You can kind of see that line, but you can't really see it in the final render. And I think it's worth it for not having that line going down when you're starting. So there you go. Now you know how to make this Vellum simulation animation. It's not a real simulation because I don't think it's really possible in geometry nodes right now. But once simulation nodes are a thing in 3.6, I believe, then it will be. And that will be a glorious day. But for now, this is all we got. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned some. I know this was a pretty long tutorial. This is like a pretty beefy node setup. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. The file that I worked on while making this tutorial will be available for download in the description for free if you want to just check it out. If I went too fast on any part or you got confused, you can just take that file and kind of dissect it. I hope you enjoyed. Like I said, I'm going to be making more tutorials in the future. So if you like this, if you like geometry nodes, why not subscribe? It really helps me and you might learn something along the way. So thanks for giving me your time and have a nice day.